Hello, I'm Thomas. I'm calling from Perth, Western Australia. I'm your MC for this session. Today we have our speaker, Kevin Kohler. Following his presentation, we'll move on to a live Q&A session where Kevin will respond to your questions. You can submit questions through the Swapcard live discussion feature. Then after 45 minutes, we'll bring this session to an end. Kevin is a senior tech policy specialist at the Simon Institute for Long-Term Governance. From 2022 to 2024, he has worked in the global risk team at the World Economic Forum, co-authoring the annual Global Risk Report. From 2019 to 2022, he has worked at the Center for Security Studies, EAGxVirtual, providing policy-oriented research on disaster risk management and tech policy to the Swiss government and other partners. So I'll please welcome Kevin, and I'll pass it to you.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and a warm welcome from my side to all who are tuning in at this hour, and excited to chat a bit about international AI governance and stuff like the multilateral system and what we can do. All right, so the idea is that I give sort of like an input of maybe 15, max 20 minutes to give you a bit of an overview first of sort of like the Simon Institute, and what we do, what is sort of, what do we mean sort of like by this idea of readiness for AGI, and then a bit like how does maybe sort of the multilateral system, or especially for example the United Nations, right? How do they sort of like fall in within sort of like this broader area of international AI governance? All right, so first things first, Simon Institute for Long-Term Governance. We're based in Geneva, Switzerland, which is also one of the main hubs of the United Nations, right? So it's, for example, where the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction is, but it's also, for example, where the International Telecommunication Union is. There's a lot of standardization work. There's a lot of internet governance work. We're a quite recent institution. Right now, we're sort of like 6 people full-time. We're also still growing a bit. And we're named after Herbert Simon. I don't know if people nowadays still know Herbert Simon, but essentially, aside from Geoffrey Hinton, who's recently just also made this feat, I think he's the only other one who both has sort of like a Turing Award and a Nobel Prize in his case in economics. And so he has basically done a lot of interesting work, both sort of like in decision making, bounded rationality, as well as AI. And I think that sort of like fits our intersection, where we both sort of like try to think about advanced AI and technology, as well as sort of like, let's say, this complex decision making at the international level. And in terms of what we actually do day to day, on the one hand, we do like some research, but I think a lot of our work is essentially also interviews and workshops with stakeholders. And also sort of like with the idea of, for example, doing trainings for policymakers and diplomats in Geneva who maybe otherwise have a more generalist background. And I think for them, it's also useful to sort of like hear what are sort of like current discussions and yeah, what they can think about. To make this a bit more concrete, especially if I think for the audience here, one way to think about it is that we're sort of like at the intersection of sort of like multiple networks, and that we sort of like try to bridge like some gaps. For example, obviously, I think many here will be familiar sort of like with the existential risk and global catastrophic risk community. But of course, this community, this is like started, you know, around Oxford, Cambridge, a bit the Bay Area, and was maybe not as present in sort of like these more classic sort of like national disaster risk management communities. For example, I can give you an example. Like in 2019, I was sort of like at the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. That's sort of like on the UN level, the global platform for that. And I think back then there was essentially almost no overlap between these communities. I think by now that has changed a bit, and I think that's useful because that also means basically both communities understand sort of like each other's concepts, right? Each other's language, and I think that's sort of maybe the road in some sense to mainstreaming also these concerns around GCR and X risks in the long run. Essentially to at some point maybe include them in something like, for example, the UN Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, / maybe it's the next framework that will follow after that. And in that regard, for example, we have done some work with the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And then the other thing, and I think that's the thing that I will talk about today, is that we also try to be a bit sort of like in between sort of like these networks concerned about AI governance, AI safety, maybe be sort of like closer to Silicon Valley, right? And the multilateral system here in Geneva and diplomacy. And because again, we feel sometimes, right, these communities live in quite different realities, and again, sort of like bringing both communities together, and sort of like helping to understand each other, and also basically giving agency to people based on that, I think is something that we try to do. And one thing that I'll specifically highlight in this context that we're currently working on, for example, is this sort of like track of the UN Global Digital Compact. This was sort of like an agreement accepted by the UN General Assembly in September of this year. And this will include basically some new bodies on the UN level on AI. And that's, for example, processes that we're following. All right. So what's sort of like high level the idea, right? When I include this sort of like in the title, societal readiness for AGI. The thing is, of course, right, like AGI is a very loaded term. It's actually a quite ambiguous term. People understand different things under AGI. But I think sort of like high level, I think there's good reasons to presume that sort of like AI systems will keep getting more powerful. Right, so like one way to look at this is that there's still sort of like more room for just sort of like scaling, and then aside from just sort of like scaling or just like scaling pre-training, there's obviously also room for, let's say, more innovations around algorithms and other things, right? I think at least sort of like for the foreseeable futures, we should sort of like expect to keep getting more powerful AI models. And I think one somewhat useful way to think about this, or at least sort of like how I think internally a lot of sort of like the big labs think about it nowadays, is essentially that rather than sort of like maybe having AGI is sort of like one point in time, because again, like some may define it by like some economic impact, right, which can be quite later. Some define it by like robotics and etc. Having sort of like a graduated scale and thinking sort of like where we are on this, again, obviously somewhat ambiguous, right? But I think we're sort of like nearing both sort of like agents, competent systems, as well as potentially systems that, for example, could produce some real risk, for example, for misuse, for example, with regards to bioweapons and things like that, right? And the interesting thing here, maybe, or the analogy here, is that I think the labs, they think for themselves, sort of like if we reach sort of like different levels, right? What do we need to have internally? For example, maybe the more powerful the systems get, for example, the more maybe you need to have, like, let's say, some cybersecurity requirements and things like that. And I think to some degree, we can also think on a societal level, and what kind of things do we need essentially if we get these more powerful AI systems? Because I said, I think it's not just not just to the companies, and in some sense, sometimes not even just sort of like narrow within AI, sort of like what kind of things we kind of like need to manage the risks as we sort of like move towards more powerful AI systems. To give you a concrete example, again, sort of like if you think, for example, AI in biorisk, right? Like if we think that maybe it becomes easier either sort of like for actors, like, for example, these sort of like Japanese sect in the 90s, right, that tried to do like some bioterrorism with very mixed success, but maybe like sort of like future LLMs will make that easier. Then maybe we want to sort of like ensure that sort of like the bottlenecks in these processes have like some screening, right? And for example, DNA synthesis screening is something that's not even sort of like directly within AI, but it's sort of like relevant to, I think, risks that are related to AI, right? And I think that's why we think sort of like having thinking a bit along those levels, at least sort of like one way that one can think about this. And one sort of like challenge in that area is, obviously, I think we're all familiar with that, right? Is sort of like the idea of the pacing problem, that the technology changes quite fast, but many governance systems don't change as fast. And if you think of the UN, you obviously have, or even the multilateral system outside of the UN, you have a lot of actors, and that means sort of like a lot of work to align. And historically has not always been that fast, right? And I think we see our role maybe also basically there, helping sort of like the UN and multilateral system to pick up these topics and sort of like to be agile on that end. All right. So let's move sort of like to the question, what is maybe sort of like the role of the UN or more broadly sort of like multilateral frameworks within sort of like international AI governance, right? Because I think there are obviously also sort of like strong tensions between like some nation states and so on. And I think then sometimes some people can just sort of be broadly skeptical that it can sort of like do anything. And I think one analogy that I personally find useful is sort of the analogy to Coke. So they basically sort of like back in sort of like the 70s to 80s, sort of marketing researchers would sort of like try to research, what's the perfect Coke? And you can sort of like try a different mixture, you go ask people and so on. But what they found after a while is actually, well, maybe there is no sort of like one perfect Coke because people have different preferences, right? So rather the optimal solution is essentially have different Cokes, right? You sort of like almost have like a regime of different types of Coke that can sort of like fulfill different functions. And I think somewhat along similar lines, for example, for AI governance. Again, these here, they're just sort of like exemplary. They're not really meant to be comprehensive. But obviously, there are some challenges that are more easy to solve on national level. I think there are some challenges that are maybe more easy to solve bilaterally or minilaterally. But there are also some things where I think sort of like multilateral action with essentially a lot of actors involved is advantageous, right? And if you think about other sort of like cross-cutting big challenges, like for example, how we in the end sort of like gotten like a nuclear governance regime, it's similar in the sense like there are bilateral agreements between countries, for example, on sort of like let's say, for example, START treaties and so on, like things like this. Then there are sort of like minilateral treaties, for example, in things like export control, right, like nuclear suppliers group. And there are global institutions, right, like for example, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And again, I think that's sort of like one useful sort of like high level frame to think about it. And even if you look at sort of like international fora with many actors, right? Not all of them have sort of like the same advantages. Obviously, sort of like somewhat smaller groups with more like-minded states are maybe a bit faster moving. On the other hand, I think if you really want something where you want to have sort of a global political legitimacy, I think the best form is and sort of like remains the United Nations, where you really have sort of like these 193 states involved. And maybe last but not least, just to highlight, right, like even during a time like the Cold War, I think the multilateral system has managed to get like some quite substantial successes. Doesn't mean that, again, maybe we can replicate this one for one, but I think it's also just good to keep in mind when sometimes we feel a bit, there is so much tension between the big powers, like what can we do? Well, at least even during the Cold War, right, that there was a lot of tension between big powers, and we still managed, I think, to get some quite substantial agreements going. All right, now let's bring this a bit from the high level more down to something that we currently work on, and that's this UN Global Digital Compact. The idea here is essentially that there will be some form of sort of like independent international scientific panel on AI, a bit somewhat modeled on the idea of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which sort of like helps to sort of like foster scientific consensus with political legitimacy, and which I think is sort of like a good foundation also later on for potential political action. Then there's sort of like a bit a more open-ended global dialogue that maybe also involves sort of like different types of stakeholder groups, and potentially also some kind of like sort of like affirmative form of multilateralism that helps countries to build up sort of like some capacities, right? Because there is sort of a bit like this trade-off. If you have a scientific panel, realistically, a lot of sort of like the expertise maybe is sort of like currently mostly in Western countries, but to have sort of like the political legitimacy, I think you want really to have like some geographic balance, and I think having sort of like some form of capacity building there is sort of like something that helps in between. And there in this process, essentially, we are now in sort of this interesting institutional design phase. So what we're doing essentially, we're doing a lot of interviews, and we're sort of like trying to research and think about sort of like these trade-offs. to then basically give inputs to countries that sort of like lead this process, to ensure that on the one hand, this doesn't just sort of like turn out to be a nothing burger, right? So like something that just like ends up somewhere in a drawer, but also to ensure that it's sort of like designed in a way that that is positive, and it doesn't necessarily like follow some framing that could also involve some risks. It's not our only priority. We're also following, for example, sort of like the Bletchley track, and more generally, as said, we do sort of like workshops and things on that end. Again, for example, if that is relevant for some of the people here. But yeah, I just wanted to give this sort of like as an example. And then I think it's probably good if I stop yapping at some point, so that we have some space for chatting freely. And very, very happy to hear both questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So we have a question. How would you say the average person can get involved, and what can they do on the subject? It can feel like this big subject that one can't personally do anything about.
Yeah. I mean, look, I fully agree. It can feel overwhelming. I think for us, part of the answer also for me is to focus only sort of like on one piece of the puzzle, or one or two pieces of the puzzle, right? So we're not trying to do absolutely everything. I think for example, we have sort of like an advantage in sort of like being on the ground in Geneva, and sort of like having these networks with also the diplomats there and the people that actually negotiate these treaties. So that's why we think we probably have a comparative advantage in sort of like ensuring that part of it goes well. But I think there are many other moving parts, right? And so yeah, I would say, even if it can feel intimidating, right? Like we still need to try to make sense of it, try to think about it. And I think it can make sense if you feel like something that is sort of like reasonably promising, to just sort of like choose that and see yourself sort of like within a broader network of actors, but not every actor actually doesn't need to do everything, right?
Okay, thank you. A question from Elizabeth. Do you think that we need a pause in AI development to better adapt to the current narrow generative AI before introducing AGI in the society? Given the fact the policies like EU AI Act requires around 3 years to come into complete effectiveness.
Yeah, I think this one is a tricky one, and I fully understand from where it comes from, right? I would caveat it sort of like before I give my answer by two things, right? The first is, again, if you think about sort of like different actors in an ecosystem, like for example AI governance, I think it makes sense to have some actors that maybe are, for example, more on the advocacy side, and maybe push, on the Overton window, and sort of like try to get maybe to push for a solution that maybe wouldn't really be sort of like that plausible to be sort of like passing in many countries, or sort of like between many countries at the moment. But again, there can sort of be value in sort of like putting some pressure, right? Whereas there's also some value in sort of like maybe working more closely with sort of like these diplomats, etc. But then maybe also not being as much out there. Second caveat is, I can give you sort of like an answer for me personally, right? I'm not sure this if there's sort of like a Simon Institute position on that, and I have only joined quite recently, right? So I don't want to like say something and otherwise people will be upset. I would say, as said, I think it can make sense for some people to push for something like that, but I think comparatively where I see myself maybe sort of like focusing on narrow interventions that can reduce risk, even if we don't sort of like have a sort of like very broad pause, I think seems quite impactful to me, because I think for many sort of like problems, even sort of like global catastrophic risk, right? If you think of like misuse or something like that, I think you can at least already significantly reduce it without sort of like having a broad stop, by sort of like focusing on sort of like specific levers and specific bottlenecks.
Okay, thank you. A question from James Norris. Given the UN's AI high-level advisory bodies report completely ignores existential/global catastrophic risk, what probability would you assign to the UN for advocating for global pause of frontier AI development?
I think the problem is, right, like the UN as a body, right, like it has 193 countries. Obviously, not all of them have like de facto the same powers, like the same amount of people following the topic. But I think the way to think about the UN is that I think you can sort of like, for example, you can push norms there, or for example, if we can push, for example, more scientific consensus around the risks, right, with political legitimacy, like we have for the IPCC, that I think there is more of a shared understanding of where we are, and so also less wiggle room, for example, for politicians to kind of choose the experts they want to follow with that. Then I think that helps, but I wouldn't sort of like expect very sort of like strong language immediately. I think it's a process. I think if we have, so for example, something like an independent international panel on AI, I think that obviously should also look at global risks and sort of like see and sort of like produce hopefully authoritative report, right, like where we are on that, and help people sort of like find consensus in that. But I think for very strong words at the moment, there is maybe not enough consensus or not enough perception of consensus on that question.
Okay, another question on probability. A question from Dennis. How do you honestly estimate a probability of establishing multilateral regulatory agreement on AI that actually works or is enforceable?
Yeah, I would say it like this. Right now, we're still a step away from that, right? I think, for example, if we can, for example, use the climate analogy, in the climate, you first sort of like had this consensus building, basically late 80s with the IPCC, and later on, actually, then sort of the UN General Assembly thought, okay, we create this intergovernmental negotiation committee that then sort of like drafted a framework. Then you had sort of like the UNFCCC framework, and then you have sort of like tied it with a more political process that actually sort of like negotiates action, right? Because scientifically, I think you can only sort of like, let's say, for example, estimate risk, right? But you can't really tell policymakers necessarily what to do about it. But that's sort of like a values question, and I think that's sort of like more in the realm of politics. So I think in some sense we're in an earlier stage here, but of course, again, it depends a bit where like different regimes go, right? Like if maybe at some point, for example, there is more universal buy-in, for example, and sort of like these sort of like commitments to have, for example, some minimum evals, maybe that you want to sort of like pass, at least sort of like on for like some global catastrophic risk and things like that before you put like something on the market. You could at least sort of like some norms or some guidance for that on a global level. I think in some areas we have things like that. So I think we could eventually move there, but I would say we're still a step away.
Hey, thank you, Kevin. I see Sarah's question, but just before that, I'll skip over to Norman's question. I'll come back to Sarah's question. Okay, Norman's question is, what is your perspective on the expected value of affecting AI governance on an international versus national level? For the latter, is it only worthwhile to affect the leading countries, US, UK, China, or is there value in affecting other countries as well?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, if you think about sort of like focusing on national policy, obviously the biggest players impacting their policy has the biggest impact. But that doesn't necessarily mean that smaller countries cannot play a role, right? Like I think in quite a few sort of like governance subjects, there are sometimes like some smaller countries that just basically specialize a bit, you know, and smaller countries don't maybe have sort of like the diplomatic or even economic capacities of like to focus on sort of like all topics at the same time and make that sort of like a mission, right? But I think that they can potentially also have an impact, both sort of like as if they do sort of like something first, right, as a model, or someone that, for example, gets different stakeholders together. So again, it depends on the individual circumstances. Obviously, I think there's more expected value in sort of like working on AI policy in the US, in China, and in Europe than maybe in other parts. But I wouldn't discourage it. I honestly feel that there are sort of like multiple paths to impact there. On the international system, as said, I think like for many things, right? It's a bit hard to see, and I think one important point that maybe I didn't emphasize as much before, and is also that you get sort of like a coherent regime, right? There's sort of like different tracks, like for example, the Global Digital Compact, and for example, sort of like a Bletchley track are complementary, right? And not sort of like competing with each other. Because for example, the Bletchley track has a state of the science report, right? Will probably not continue, but we will either sort of like have a report in this sort of like AI safety network, or on the UN level, or some mix, and sort of like ensuring that sort of like these different pieces of the puzzle fits together. I think it's useful, you know, and for example, even if you think about something like, say, let's say, for example, capacity building, right? So like UN, obviously there's also a big question around like digital divide. I think if you can, for example, direct some of the capacity building and say, well, we want to build a governance capacity, and that means, for example, that we want to help more countries and actually more regions, for example, to build out AI safety institutes. That also sort of like helps, for example, I would say sort of like this Bletchley track, right? Where maybe if you have, for example, I don't know, like a regional African AI safety institute that can that sort of like has the critical mass to engage, then I think that's also sort of like positive for that regime. So again, I think it's hard to sort of like put specific numbers on it, but I would say if you have sort of like a comparative advantage somewhere, it can be worth trying, even if it's maybe not directly in US or China or something like that.
Thank you. Just a quick remark, a comment from Dennis. Sounded like less than 1% of successful treaty. Thanks for an update. Okay. Now, the question from Sarah. What type of research, academic or from the think tank world or independent researchers, would you like to see more of to help inform your work or to help inform policy makers working on global AI governance?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's sort of like a long list of things that one could do. And one of the exciting thing, right, is both like, maybe it can feel overwhelming, but I feel like also there's so many things where essentially if you're motivated and you're willing to dig a bit, you can actually sort of like add value, because no one is sort of like covering it very fully, right? I can give you, for example, the example of like the types of research that we do, or that is, for example, particularly value for us, for example, in this specific context of the Global Digital Compact. But I think it will, for like other pieces of the puzzles, I think it may be different types of research, right? So, for example, for us, it's obviously useful. We're sort of like looking at all kinds of sort of like different models of sort of like science policy interfaces, especially at UN level, right? So like the most famous one is the IPCC, but there are many others. And there's sort of like different trade-offs in setting them up, right? So like how much influence do you actually, for example, allow policymakers to have? You know, like do they just sort of like acknowledge it, or do they give approval? And you know, like intuitively might sound, you don't want policymakers to mix in with science, right? But then if you read some of the case studies, it also shows it's a bit of like a forcing function that like actually engages them, and maybe it gives a higher probability of action later on, something like that, right? So I think analysis is useful. I think more generally, I think what I also find useful, and that's maybe sort of like less on the applied level, is sort of like this question of sort of like almost like grand strategies or you know, sort of like regime coherence. So like I think there could still be sort of like more people publishing sort of like their sort of like long-term view for sort of like how this goes well, and maybe sort of like which institutions and sort of like which arrangements play which role in it, right? I think this is something that we internally try to think about. But I would love to see sort of like a more thinking around that, for example. Yeah, but I think in general, yeah, happy to also chat offline if there's something specific. I think there's so many things to work on. I think you will not be bored. Yeah.
Thank you, Kevin. And just after Dennis posted his comment, James Norris replied him. Okay, so on the less than 1%, James said several of us are working to increase those odds, and post catastrophe, it does substantially increase.
Yes. So I didn't for the first time. What are the 1% referring to?
Dennis and James, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that's the estimated probability that Dennis, you wrote about a successful treaty across countries.
Okay.
Mhm.
I think it depends what kind of treaty you think about, right? Again, I think some people have sort of like the model. You need to have sort of like a treaty that includes everything, right, and governs all. But if you look at if you look at examples also like previous regimes, I think maybe there is sort of like a room for eventually having some global treaty, but maybe it's narrow, right? It focuses sort of like on specific questions on which there is global agreement. Because if you think about it, as said, like not even, or let's say this, like there's definitely not sort of like ideas of like universal exposure, or even sort of like universal similar understanding of sort of like every question in AI, right? Like just to maybe give you some examples. I don't know, like if you, for example, talk about sort of like AI's impact on democracy, right? I think it's a relevant question. But realistically, you will not really do this at the UN level, because you know countries have different polities and they don't necessarily want to change their polities, right? Or similarly, if it maybe comes to question of something like misinformation or bias, maybe you can sort of like get high level agreement or something like that. But if you look at it, I think governments handle things quite differently. They are in quite different situations. You know, like in some countries, like for example, the discourse is like, I don't know, like how can we ensure that minorities are better represented in data sets, right? And then there are countries where minorities are actually very much overrepresented in data sets, and maybe that is also not good, right? So I'm just saying, like, I think I think there's a higher than 1% chance that there will essentially be at some point a treaty, but it will not be a sort of like it will not be an all-encompassing treaty. I think that seems quite unlikely that we'll sort of like have global agreement on everything AI. I can still hear you. I mean, otherwise I can also go out of share mode and just check the chat if that is useful. Yeah. Okay. I think we have lost Thomas here, but let me just maybe stop sharing and open the chat. But can I see everyone's question in the chat? Not really, right? I can't somehow. Yeah. Okay, I think what I was sort of like try to reconnect Thomas. I can sort of like maybe keep on expanding so some previous points made. Unfortunately, I can't see because I have a slightly different setup on speaker side. I can't see your questions, but I think one thing, if we maybe go back to the previous presentation, right? Like maybe one thing that's interesting is to think a bit about sort of like how do these trade-offs, for example, for the institutional design of something like an international scientific panel on AI look like. And I think one thing I've already mentioned, right, is sort of like we want both scientific and political legitimacy, right? And for example, I can give you like some concrete examples there. If you, for example, look at the climate example, right? There was actually, interestingly enough, right, there were already climate assessments, even like global level climate assessments before the IPCC. On the one hand, by countries, like for example, there was a UK assessment, there were US assessments, but they maybe didn't really have the political legitimacy, right? Because you need to think about like policymakers are generalists, right? And if you are there to represent sort of like your country's interest, and maybe if you don't have like have a scientific witness in the room that right you can trust, maybe it's a bit harder to sort of like take big political actions basically based on just believing that. And the second interesting example there is actually there was even something on the UN level. So there was actually sort of like a first report, both by the WMO, so the World Meteorological Organization, and UNEP, so the UN Environmental Program. These are also the organizations that later on would sponsor the IPCC. And there was literally a report like chaired by the same person that would later on also chair the first IPCC, right? I think it was called Bert Bolin. And the interesting thing is like this previous report didn't nearly have as much of an impact as the IPCC, right? And I think that's sort of like one reason why maybe I'm open to maybe having like some kind of arrangement where you do have some level of political approval. Because if you have like some level of political approval of a report, that means actually you have a forcing function, like policymakers need to engage, and I think you also have essentially more buy-in down the line, right? So I think you have a higher chance of political action. Another thing, obviously, I think, for example, that we need to think about when we, for example, design something like this is sort of like how do we handle different types of stakeholders, right? So obviously the classic stakeholders at UN level are states, but they're not the only relevant stakeholders, right? Obviously, we have the private sector, we have civil society, we have academia, and different regimes have sort of like quite different levels of involvement of these stakeholders, right? For example, if you think about AI, realistically, the private sector actually has a lot of relevant expertise, a lot of relevant infrastructure, etc. So I think there could be an argument for involving them based on that. At the same time, there is obviously sort of like the question of co-opting processes, right? Which I think in the case of climate and some other examples, later on, maybe the private sector has also sort of like tried to shape things in its own interest. And now I see Thomas is back.
My internet connection dropped off a bit. I am back. So what did I miss? Please continue.
Okay, not much. The problem is I cannot actually see the questions on the side, so I've just expanded a bit on like some trade-offs in sort of like designing something like a global digital compact. But if there are questions or comments from the chat, then I think we should prioritize that, and that's sort of like me yapping.
Okay, no problem. I think the next question is Norman's. What is your perspective on a scenario where we reach AI non-proliferation? Nuclear weapons are often used as an analog for advanced AI, but we reach a point where several nation states have access to them rather than none. If this is likely, what would near misses look like if there would be any?
Yeah. It's definitely the case that some people sort of like think along this sort of like non-proliferation analogy, right? And I think if you do that, right, like for example, there's sort of these sort of like chips for peace proposals or things like that. I think it's just important to think that then at least you also need to think about sort of like the benefit sharing part, right? Because non-proliferation also means essentially some countries, like in the nuclear regime, you have the haves and the have-nots, right? And that means that if, of course, technology like AGI would also have massive upside, right? And I think to convince other countries maybe to that they do not need sort of like a national capacity like that, I think there also needs to be sort of like a credible commitment to sharing benefits and sort of like peaceful applications, right? That's sort of like the first thing. And the second thing, wait, there was a more specific question at the end, right? Sorry.
That was the last question I can see. And there was a comment from Angel just replying to Norman. But the difference is nuclear is not decentralized as AI models are, and not in the hands of different corporations.
Yes. I think this is an interesting thing to think about, right? Because also you can think about stuff like, let me give you an example actually from nuclear stuff, like from the early days, right? Like 1946, that was sort of like the heyday of nuclear one worldism, right? There's sort of like this, there's a great book, One World or None, co-authored by many of sort of like the thinkers of these time, including sort of like Albert Einstein. So for example, there's an article in there, for example, sort of like on nuclear terrorism, right? And so like the idea, well, you know, a nuclear device is actually quite small, and maybe there's sort of like nuclear terrorism in the future, and that means that can annihilate a full city, right? So essentially, the only sort of like viable way forward is essentially sort of like a complete surveillance state, something like that, right? And in the end, it's turned out sort of like intervening at the point where sort of like an individual already has a nuke is not the most efficient. Actually, there are sort of like other bottlenecks, right? Like where we can sort of like intervene much earlier that are much more centralized. And if you sort of like intervene there as control points, then actually you don't need to be sort of like as invasive in controlling other things. And if you look at actually sort of like not just sort of like access to frontier AI models, but you look, for example, sort of like at the chip supply chain, right? There's sort of like a lot of bottlenecks that are very concentrated. So I wouldn't immediately think that just because like some aspects of AI are sort of like very decentralized, that it is inherently impossible if you would want to sort of like have something like non-proliferation asset. I think probably most AI systems that they interact with, right, like they have sort of like logical dependencies on probably like ASML somewhere in the Netherlands, right, and sort of like probably some like TSMC fab in Taiwan, etc. So again, I think we're not really there at the moment in terms of sort of like regime, but I would say at least sort of like in theory, I think also AI would have sort of like bottlenecks that could in theory be used for something like a non-proliferation regime if that's sort of like the way forward.
Right. And the discussion is very active. I'm loving this. So Norman continued to comment, and I am referring to a scenario in which advanced AI is approaching or already reaches a level sufficient to be a national security threat. It is safe to assume that nation states will have direct control or ownership over them. If you're referring to dangerous AI being developed independently, that is a different conversation altogether, I believe. And Angel replied, yes, definitely. I'm just wondering how to control exactly what they're discussing now and work nations actors.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is obviously this is sort of like a big question going forward, right? I think right now it's very clear, sort of like private sector dominated. But of course, if technology becomes more powerful, there is a question, right? Will you see like some form of soft nationalization or something like that? It's hard to know at this point, and also hard to know sort of like what is optimal, right? Maybe just to give you, for example, an example of a different technology, right? For example, Russia and computers and the internet, right? Interestingly, Russia was not really behind in these sort of like chip designs or something like that, because they actually they got more or less always like the most recent sort of like designs from the US through their intelligence services, and they had like some quite advanced things, but then they never really sort of like got this sort of like, let's say, more economic feedback loop, more civilian economic feedback loop going, where, you know, like initially chips was like very heavily dominated by military investments, right, like missiles and stuff like that, and they never really got this feedback loop going. And through that, in the end, they were way behind to the US in ICT and things like that, right? So I think there's a lot of potential downsides to securitizing, right? And to think about nationalizing. So I think it needs to be done sort of like cautiously if actors think about it for like many separate reasons. But yeah, I think it's a legitimate question, and it's a question. It's a question I think, yeah, that is still like somewhat open. I think right now we're very clear sort of like in this private sector paradigm, but there is a case that it may not last forever. That cannot, at least cannot be excluded at this point.
Okay, and just lastly, a comment from Angel. Okay, that sounds encouraging. Maybe there are some bottlenecks that could be controlled, kind of like blockchain, which is also decentralized.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I would say, look, if there would be sort of like the political will to control, I think, sort of like, let's say, for example, the pace of AI development, I think then probably the easier levers are probably on the hardware layer, where they sort of have more concentration, you have sort of longer lead times, and it's sort of like harder to enter probably. And yeah, so I would say that there is a possibility of something like that eventually. As said, I don't think we're sort of like close to that at the moment, except sort of like for mostly sort of like unilateral export controls, which are probably more motivated sort of like by strategic competition between countries than sort of like controlling the pace of AI development. But in theory, I think there would be levers to do things like that.
So I can see comments from Elizabeth agree with the intensification in global chip war. And just wrapping up, I can see James sharing a link. This is often called compute governance. So this is an EA forum link, compute governance being the topic. And with that, I think let's bring the session to a close. Thank you, Kevin, for the presentation. Thank you, everyone, for the Q&A, the discussion. This is very, very intriguing, interesting, and important. And lastly, thank you, everyone, for watching. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.